just occasionally, anniversaries occur which give everyone pleasure to celebrate. In 1993, this happened on the Ffestiniog Railway. The story started many years ago on the narrow-gauge railway from Port Penrhyn to Bethesda, where Linda, named after the daughter of the 3rd Baron Penrhyn, shunted wagons on the quayside. Linda was one of a class of 3 locomotives bought from Hunslets in the 1880s and 1890s to work the slate trains. Charles and Blanche were her companions, and they too were named after members of the Penrhyn family. Even in the early 60s, when these shots were taken by local news cameraman David Sutcliffe, the railway was a bit of an anachronism. Time was running out for Welsh narrow-gauge steam, and the sight of these old engines was already considered to be rare and worth recording. On this day, just before the railway closed, Linda was working the main line train between Quarry and Port, returning to Bethesda with the empty wagons and those loaded with supplies for the quarries. Today, when we look back to this seemingly simpler age, how things have changed. Alas, the railway closed, and even the bus no longer runs. Yet it was the closure of this line in 1962 that led to the anniversary 30 years later, which gave everyone so much pleasure. Because Linda was lent to the Ffestiniog Railway in the summer of 1962, and that is where it all started. An intensive service of trains was run over the anniversary weekend. The vintage shuttle had a locomotive at both ends to allow a quick turnaround at Minfon. Sergeant Murphy also worked on the Penrhyn Railway, and after nearly 40 years out of use, was restored in 1993 to serve the Ffestiniog. The train has Felin Heli at the rear. This baby Hunslet now works on the Launceston Steam Railway, but was built to work in the Dinorwig quarries. The stars of the Hunslet Hundred show were those 3 Penrhyn Railway locomotives, Charles, Linda and Blanche, brought back together for the first time for over 30 years to celebrate the sisters' centenary. Charles was the first of the 3 mainline Hunslets delivered to Penrhyn. He was built in 1882 and remains in Penrhyn colours as an 040. Blanche, named after the wife of the 3rd Baron Penrhyn, was fitted with a pony truck and a 4-wheeled tender when she came to work on the Ffestiniog. The works plates reflect the century's service of the engines and the proud tradition of the builders' Hunslets. Penrhyn engines always carried buckets in order to sand the frequently damp rails, and they were restored for the weekend as a reminder of former times. Preparing the locomotives for their duties at Boston Lodge demands a lot of effort by a lot of people. There is a great deal of oiling, cleaning and polishing to be done. There is so much brass work to be shined, and on an occasion like this it just wouldn't do for an old lady to be less than her best. It was wise to be up early to photograph the show. Permits were issued to the works and hordes of people descended to take the unique shots of so many engines preparing for the road. Dolbadan from the Llanberis Lake Railway used to work in the quarries nearby at Dinorwig. She is one of the later baby Hunslets built in 1922. Behind her, Una from the Welsh Slate Museum at Llanberis waits for Dolbadarn to move off. The locomotives were all allocated various shunting duties over the festival and every morning jostled for position to take up their assignments. Una is a sister to Ffestiniog resident Britomart, and they both worked at the Penyr quarry at Nantlle. Una seldom gets out for a good run, and so this was a special occasion for her. Peter Pan, a tiny Kerr Stewart, was used throughout its life on contract work. It now resides on the Leighton Buzzard narrow gauge railway. The locomotive had a minor difficulty on the Ffestiniog Railway as her wheels are set to a slightly different rail gauge. However, taken with care, this didn't cause a problem, as the deviation was only small. One of the nice things about the festival was the fact that the 1863 veteran England locomotive Prince, the old gent of the Ffestiniog, was joined by the younger 1864-built Palmerston. This was Palmerston's first show since 1939. Despite the 1910 rebuilding plate, she had completed a 20-year-long second rebuild from a derelict state only weeks before. There were serious discussions about operating matters, needed to ensure that everything started and finished to plan, in the complex series of moves designed to deliver the timetable. Locomotives were made ready with steam up and were suitably photographed again and again. Train crews stood by waiting to perform their part of the operation, anxious lest the appointed time should somehow slip past. The baby Hunslets were used to haul freight trains over the weekend. These were loaded during the day at Minffordd and brought to Boston Lodge in the evening, so Una was able to trundle out loaded skip wagons of shale, ready to take them to be emptied by the new sidings at the top of the yard. In marked contrast, the glorious David Lloyd George swept past on the main line. Una then slowly moved back to present her skips for emptying, doing much the same job as she would have done years ago in the quarries. In Porthmadog, Sergeant Murphy leads a small convoy of locomotives that has arrived from Boston Lodge for duty, complete with the vintage shuttle train in tow. The whole ensemble now needs to be arranged in the right order, and the first move towards this is for the sergeant to precede Britomart and Irish Mail to the water tank. Irish Mail is another ex-Dinorwig engine and now works on the West Lancashire Railway. It is delightful how many of these baby Hunslets have passed down to preservation. During the festival, there were 9 of them to be seen on the railway. For many of the locomotives, it was a rare opportunity for a long run on a mainline 2-foot gauge railway, and the occasion gave much joy. Whilst discussing the next part of this complicated move, a gentle aroma of coal smoke floated from the chimneys, alerting the enthusiasts to the presence of engines not fired on oil. Holy War gently moves the vintage shuttle train down the number 3 extension so that Irish Mail and Britomart can then come forward to seek out the yard shuttle. This complicated piece of shunting will then be completed by Sergeant Murphy, joining the front of Holy War's train on the extension road. Meanwhile, with the brass as shining as it's ever going to be, a certain amount of social chit-chat takes place whilst the price of coal is reviewed and the splendid state of cleanliness of the locomotives is carefully compared. It's taken hours of work to reach this stage, which may give a clue why steam engines, lovely though they are, especially coal-fired ones, tend to be the domain of the more determined enthusiast. Linda, complete with Penryn bucket and a very splendid lamp, leads Blanche out of Porthmadog on a mainline train to Blaenau Ffestiniog. At Boston Lodge Halt, people thronged on and off the trains to visit the attractions at Boston Lodge Works. All the trains that stopped there over the weekend did so for longer than scheduled, causing a fair amount of mayhem for the operators. In fact, some 12,500 journeys were made over the weekend, exceeding maximum summer loadings by far. Blanche leads Linda into Minffordd, which was the changing point for the shuttle down into Minffordd Yard. When the ladies, Blanche and Linda, have left on their way to Blaenau, the shuttle train, with 2 baby Hunslets in charge, leaves with a full load of visitors for the yard. The train served Minffordd every half hour. It was like a narrow-gauge Clapham Junction for the weekend. This wasn't the only way to get about. A vintage Crossville bus provided a special service between Porthmadog and Minffordd. It didn't show Bethesda as the destination, which perhaps was just as well. Irish Mail led the train in the uphill direction, using a brake valve in the cab to stop. Britomart was providing the vacuum for the braking power, as she so often works passenger specials on the Ffestiniog, and so has been fitted with an ejector. As the National Power hot air balloon gives us an unusual view of the yard and the railway, Sergeant Murphy arrives with a connecting vintage shuttle from Porthmadog. The view of the yard from the railway only gave half a clue to the immense activity going on there. Lilla, another Hunslet, which also used to work in Penrhyn Quarry, drifts into the yard, which was packed full of all sorts of machinery, accompanied with vigorous music from a Ruth fairground organ. Alan George from the Vale of Tavy on Drive and Engine caused queues all day. Steam locomotives, large and small, mingled amongst the visitors, enjoying themselves in the yard. Models and the real thing, farmyard machinery, the miniature railway. Minffordd Central, terminus of the miniature railway, was the focus for steam models of all kinds, but doubles in the winter as the storage sheds for the Ffestiniog's fleet of vintage carriages. The 20s Ruston engine, for all its size, developed only 120 horsepower, which is less than many of today's cars. Not all the locomotives were steam. Every railway has to have some diesels. The Ffestiniog's Mary Ann in the background was the first engine to work on the newly restored railway in 1954. Irish Mail from the West Lancashire Railway heads the empty air-conditioned coaches for the shuttle train into the oddly named Bath Exchange Station. The sheep know the Bath. In the adjacent field, they drink from it. Today, the miniature railway draws water from it for the engines. At Porthmadog, the empties for the mixed train are drawn into the platform by Palmerston and David Lloyd George, whilst Ol Badarn waits to head the first Minforth shuttle train to be in position there for the day's workings. Gravity trains have been run on the Ffestiniog since 1836. In days gone by, they formed a train of up to 100 loaded wagons, running from Blaenau Ffestiniog to Porthmadog. It wasn't until 1863 that steam took over. Then passenger trains often ran up the line with a tail of empty slate wagons, and now on special occasions this is done. In recent years, a number of wagons were restored and loaded with slate, so that today a demonstration gravity train can be run for pleasure. David Lloyd George and Palmerston make up the mixed train of 15 slate wagons and a brake van by adding coaches from the sidings. But first of all, the order of the locomotives has to be reversed to allow the coal-fired Palmerston to lead. The operation evidently has a great fascination, judging by the crowd of onlookers that has gathered to watch. Yet even a sure-footed, articulated double fairley like the David Lloyd George can slip its wheels on the damp rails. Getting a double-headed mixed train on the move needs a gentle hand on the regulator as the slate wagons are unbraked and loose-coupled. The gravity train brake crew are travelling up in the empty slate wagons, with a brake van attached at the rear to guard against breakaways, and the van crew on the balcony are well versed in the art of bracing themselves for any jerk of the train at starting. In the long siding at the top of Minffordd Yard, preparations are being made to receive the gravity train. Points need to be clamped and the exact position and timing of the train checked. Meanwhile, the Sergeant Murphy runs past with the next vintage shuttle from Porthmadog. The single line is being used to its full capacity. The gravity train has been detached from the mixed at Ffestiniog. The brake van has been positioned at the Blaenau end and the train allowed to move off towards Porthmadog, rapidly gaining momentum. With the warning horn sounding at the whistle board, the train runs across Gwyndy Bank and approaches Minffordd Station. The problem with a gravity train is not so much getting it started as stopping it. A number of the wagons have brakes. The crew members sit on the slates and respond to the boss's instructions to apply and release them. Sitting on the slates in the wagon causes an odd sensation. They are stacked vertically, and as they move around in the wagon, pinch the sitter in a sensitive part of the anatomy. So don't volunteer for this business without a thick mat as protection. Before steam engines were introduced in the 1860s, the rear vehicle was a dandy wagon, not a brake van. In those days, the empties were drawn back up the line by a horse, which rode down in this wagon at the rear of the train, refueling for the next run with a generous supply of hay. On the footplate of Linda with Blanche in front, rapid progress is being made up the line, past the crossing point at Ffestiniog, which is now only used as a siding for engineers' trains, and on towards the 65-foot-high dry stone embankment of Cay Mawr. These are the views across the valley of the River Dwyrid, for which the Ffestiniog is justly proud, and the two locomotives are storming round the sinuous curves almost at their full 20 miles per hour. The speedometer is on the left, the vacuum gauge on the right. The track here has been mostly relaid with 75-pound flat-bottom rail, giving the train a smoother ride. As we round the sharpest curve on the line, Tyler's, the view down reminds us of just how far we have climbed. Life is not all trains. One of the additional attractions was a display of veteran and vintage cars at Tanabulch station. Some of these models were the latest thing when Linda and Blanche came to the Ffestiniog Railway. Here's evident proof that there is life still for a big dreadnought ejector. After 7.5 miles of run, there is time for a brief respite. Refreshments are taken on board the locomotives, and then the train is off for the more open upper reaches of the line. The new Moelwyn Tunnel represents the crowning glory of the deviation, completed in the 1970s. Blanche and Linda are about to fill its dank length with smoke and steam, only to roar again into the sunlight at the other end. The exciting thing about rejoining the old Ffestiniog formation at Ffestiniog is the way in which it hovers over people's back gardens and almost introduces you to the families in their living rooms. The welcome at Blaenau is under special preparation by pianola as the train rounds the last few curves into the station, and at last the highest point on the line is reached. It is when we leave Blaenau that we realise that the Ffestiniog is almost like two railways. The second is the downhill journey. It is so different, and without the cab sheet, the view out of the tender of Linda is very wide. In recent years, the tranquility of Tanna Bulch has been its own best advertisement. Trains cross here on the single line, and when they arrive there is bustle and activity.
Anybody forget now? One there. One there. Anybody forget me? All right.
Across the valley, the up train can be seen, whistling for the footpath crossings in the woods, whilst the passengers on the platform await its arrival. David Lloyd George is the most powerful Ffestiniog ferry ever built. She was completed in 1993 by Boston Lodge Works and is fitted with a boiler set for £200 per square inch. DLG is one of the most fuel-efficient Ffestiniog engines, easily matching all but Linde in gallons of oil consumed per carriage pulled. The Dave regularly hauls trains of up to 13 vehicles with ease. As the passengers mill on the platform, the fireman fills the tanks with 500 gallons or more of water, enough to get to Ffestiniog. As the driver walks down to take the single line token, sails are brisk on the platform, just before the Blanche and the Linde set out for Port Maddox. Starting a heavy train from a place where the rails have been made slippy by oil and water is sometimes a tricky business. As Linde and Blanche pass the works at Boston Lodge, activity is in full swing. Even Palmerston has a slip or two and needs a helping hand. Linda gets some oil as a reward, and Sergeant Murphy sets out on another shuttle. The variety of motive power moving in and out of Porthmadog during the day and the volume of people to be handled had never been seen before. In the station forecourt, a fairground organ and the steam tug Kern moored in the harbour provided the link to the model railway exhibits in the Ganolfan nearby. There were layouts from all over Britain in many scales, all narrow gauge, and some of the models reflected the Hunslet theme of the festival. Getting a locomotive this small to move is an easier business than the real thing. Some of the wagons and locomotives modelled, especially the Garratt, would be welcome full size. Photographs of Hunslets from the past were complemented by exact scale replicas of locomotives that could be seen working outside. Even the steam dredger Seont 2 visited the festival from its home base in Carnarvon. Passengers in Victorian dress added to the scene, and the two old Ffestiniog veterans, Prince and Palmerston, took a turn on the vintage shuttle. The supervisor prepares the way for original Ffestiniog veteran double fairlie Mervyn Emrys to come forward to head a mainline train. This unusual double-ended design is now unique to the Ffestiniog, which is the only working examples left in the world. Mervyn Emrys was built in 1879 as an inventive solution to handling the growing slate traffic on this difficult, severely curved, narrow-gauge railway. Coupling on the locomotive demonstrates the cooperation needed between the driver and the fireman in order to complete this task. The hooks on the Norwegian coupling must engage properly, and this needs fine control of the locomotive as the buffer faces must be touching. Then the vacuum pipes can be put together. There wasn't very much time to carry out these manoeuvrings. The shuttle soon returned from Minffordd with its full load of passengers and had to be unloaded and then shunted rapidly in order to allow Mervyn to depart. The vintage shuttle was made up of some interesting rolling stock. The brake van number 10 was built in 1873 and became a Colonel Stevens conversion in the 1920s. Coach 23 was originally built in 1894 for the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway, later being owned by the Welsh Highland. Bug boxes 5 and 6 date from the 1860s, and number 8 is a quarryman's carriage of 1885. Operating Palmerston has added excitement. He is one of the very few coal-fired Ffestiniog locomotives. The art has had to be learned again, as everyone on this railway has now become used to oil as the fuel. Prince was the first locomotive under the new regime to depart from the corporate green livery. He went into red in the 1980s, to be followed by Merddin Emrys's restoration to Victorian carmine livery. Now the whole fleet is an assortment of colours. Perhaps it is time for Prince to change again. Merddin Emrys departs from Porthmadog with drain cocks open and the driver using the regulators of front and back bogies in an attempt to control the slipping. All good things must come to an end. In fact, the disposal scenes of the engines in the evening drew spectators to watch the fires being removed and the ash and clinker being withdrawn from the firebox.
On its way.
The final oiling was performed in the evening sun. The locomotives moved slowly back and forth from ash pit to berthing roads to be in the right position for the following day. The evening light was perfect for photography, and there are not many works with such a wonderful view as this. The old Lilla, veteran of Penrhyn quarries, has been left in almost the same condition as she was in her working days. She is staying on the Ffestiniog for a spell and will appear from time to time, still unaltered. It's only a few hours now before the locomotive's fires will be relit, so that the whole show can start again in the morning. David Lloyd George rushes past with the last down train, and the last bus makes its way across the cob on the road below.
Okay, Graham. See you then. I just thought it'd been a few relax.
We thought you may like to see the lengths we go to make sure our films are as authentic as possible in every way. You are most respectfully advised not to carry out this experiment for yourselves. We did it safely using a telephoto lens. Trespass upon the line is dangerous, and not everywhere has as much clearance as this.